Signore e signori, buonasera. Bentornati, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò. È un grande piacere, it's a great pleasure to have you here tonight. As you know, we are in the middle of a marathon that we call the Manzoni Moore Marathon. And one of the two protagonists of the marathon is right here in the audience, Michael Moore, who undertook the monumental work of translating the Betrothed. I've exercised, I'm not going to tell you for how long to pronounce the title of the book in this way. I hope it works. If it doesn't, I'm going to stick to the Italian. And tonight we are going to have probably the most fun of the different tappe of this marathon. And the title says it all, Laughing with Manzoni. And this is the result of a discussion that we had a brainstorming with the faculty in the department. And of course, our colleague and friend Eugenio Refini came to the rescue because he was teaching a course on Manzoni last spring, correct? 2 years ago, in anticipation of Michael's translation. And Michael actually, I know, participated and came to talk to the students. And during the course of this seminar, of course, papers were written. And with Eugenio, we discussed, is there something that came out that your students, former students, doctoral students, could share with the audience, the result of their research, of their interest in Manzoni today. And so the choice fell on these two brilliant graduate students, then Eugenio is going to introduce to you, Serena Moscardelli and Anita Quero, that talk about parodies. Parodies like satirized versions of a work. And to me, that's the sign when you have this kind of parodies, that's the sign that that's a great work of art. Think Petrarch. Petrarch, of course, had hundreds of followers, of people that tried to imitate him. But to me, the sign that he was really the real thing is when you start having parodies of Petrarch. You have people that do exactly the opposite of what Petrarch does in order to underline the differences, but also they make you appreciate Petrarch even more. And same thing for all the great works of literature. When there is a parody, when there is a satire of that work, it's a sign that that work really made it. It has a place in the collective imagination of a people, and of course for Manzoni, that's quite obvious. So we wanted to have an evening in which the sort of demythization of Manzoni, like taking him off the pedestal on which decades and decades of schoolwork, unfortunately, have placed him, and he's all dusted, the poor Manzoni, on that pedestal and lonely. So with this evening, we want to take him down the pedestal, have a chat face-to-face with him, and if possible, have a little laugh with him. So it's going to be a fun night, and for this, I thank once again, as I invite him to join us on the podium, my colleague and friend, Eugenio Refini. Please welcome him.
Right. Thank you very much, Stefano, for having us another night. Thank you all for being here. And I think it's really a pleasure to be doing this tonight for various reasons. Of course, we will be talking about Manzoni, one of the main authors of the Italian tradition. We are celebrating Michael Moore's brand new translation of the Promessi Sposi. You see, I said it in Italian, so I avoided the trick there in English. And then I'm really happy that we can share the work which, among some of my students, we did a couple of years ago when I was teaching this seminar on the Promessi Sposi. It was really an interesting course because I thought, let's get rid of the bibliography and all the studies and let's sort of delve into the text. And we kind of tried to close read the Promessi Sposi from beginning to end. Of course, we needed to skip a few things because it's a long novel, and when you begin to read it carefully, it takes ages, right? And one of the pleasures of that seminar was to have Michael Moore with us, and it was beautiful to see the very last stages of his revision of the translation and discuss with him what was happening in the mind of a translator while revising such a big work. And I think one of the outcomes, if I may say so, of that seminar is that we tried to rescue Manzoni from the very serious attire which normally goes with him, and we tried to think about the irony which is in there, in the Promessi Sposi, a very specific kind of irony, of course. And one way to think about the irony of Manzoni was to think about the ironic ways in which the Promessi Sposi have been read. And two of my great students, Serena and Anita, came to rescue in that case, and they proposed to write their papers on two super interesting topics. Adaptations of the Promessi Sposi in a comic way, in comics, particularly in the Walt Disney Topolino, which of course, as you all know, it's one of the most famous comics for kids, but not only for kids in the Italian tradition. And the other avenue of research, because this is really research, was adaptations for the TV. And the case study which Serena picked is a fantastic one to my mind, which is the Promessi Sposi adapted by the trio Solenghi, Lopez, Marchesini, which came out at the end of the 1980s. And I remember, watching the Promessi Sposi del trio when I was a kid, and that was, I think, one of my earliest introductions to Manzoni. And then, of course, as most Italians, I've read the Promessi Sposi at the Scuola Media, and I think, that's a very tough experience. And then again, at the Ginnasio, and then finally I got to study more Manzoni in a less scholastic, if I say so, way in college. But then the opportunity to read again the text with my students and with Michael 2 years ago was really illuminating. And I think that one of the outcomes really of this particular work, which Anita and Serena are going to share with us tonight, is that there is indeed a way to laugh with Manzoni, and by laughing with Manzoni through the example of comics and TV adaptations, we can possibly also shed light on some of the fun which is in the novel already. I think, we spent much time discussing the introduction of the Promessi Sposi, where Manzoni is probably at its best in terms of being ironic. Ironic in both the sense of irony as in literary criticism, but also ironic in the sense of being fun and being quite lighthearted about what he's doing. Then, of course, lightheartedness gets maybe a little bit on the side when we get into the novel, but still this distant reading of the Promessi Sposi through the eyes of these modern readers and modern adaptations was extremely illuminating. And I think this is one of the perks of working on questions of reception more broadly, which, as my students know, is one of my things. So without further ado, let me just introduce very briefly our speakers tonight. So we will begin with Serena, right? Serena Moscardelli. She has earned a BA in art history from the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari, and an MA in contemporary art theory from Goldsmiths, the University of London. During her BA, she also spent a year at the University College London, UCL, as an exchange student. Her research interests focus on visual culture and spatial theory, and in particular on Italian fascism's spatial politics and its relationship to contemporary everyday life. So pretty serious stuff. So tonight she's wearing a different hat. And we will then move on to Anita's presentation. Anita Quero holds a BA and an MA in Lettere Moderne from the University of Milan. Her MA thesis was already quite telling about her broad interests, Compagni di strada, allora, The Catcher in the Rye, Jack Frusciante uscito dal gruppo, e il romanzo di formazione adolescenziale. So she's very interested in what was once called the Bildungsroman. And in a way, Topolino may fit that kind of framework. So she's very interested in young adult literature, and I think this will come up in her presentation tonight. During her MA, she spent 2 years not far from New York at Bard College, working as the Italian tutor in the Italian department. So I'm really, really happy to welcome, first Serena to the podium and then Anita. So please join me in welcoming both of them for this event tonight. And thank you again to Casa, Italiana, of course, for making this possible.
Hello. let's wait. Ecco. Okay, so today I am talking about the parody of the Betrothed by the trio. The trio is this, you can see them here with Pippo Baudo, who is a TV personality in Italy. And the trio is Anna Marchesini, Tullio Solenghi, and Massimo Lopez. I want, and here you have them in another version. Eccoli qua. Okay, but I want to start with with the opening sequence of the parody, and the parody was divided in 5 episodes, and it was aired in 1990 on the Rai National Television in Italy. The clips are not subtitled. I couldn't find any subtitle for the clips, but I will try my best to explain what happens in the scenes. And for this first one, the sequence is pretty faithful to the novel. So there is the description of the lake and Don Abbondio meeting the Bravi. Okay, let me go back to the presentation. So, besides the trio's take on characters that we can see in this opening sequence, Don Abbondio behaving like a dog, or the Bravi talking like Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, the opening sequence also highlights one of the structural aspects of the parody, which is the role of the narrator. In fact, the narrator interacts both with the characters on the screen and with the audience. In the opening sequence, the solemn language of the narrator contrasts with what happens on the screen, that is, the man falling in the water. And when the male narrator transitions to the female narrator, which is played by Anna Marchesini, we assist to the amusing confusion of Manzoni's story with Little Red Riding Hood. The narrator also has the job of keeping order in the chaos of the parody, that we will see in a moment. And for this instance, the work of the trio develops the role that already exists in Manzoni's text, the role of the narrator. In the novel, the narrator too interacts with the reader and recalls their attention to the main plot after the many digressions that exist in the text. The parody then develops the comical potential of characters and situations that already are present at the level of the text. And one example is the use of language and the voice. Manzoni already creates an ironical situation when he contrasts Don Abbondio erudite language with the vulgar one used by the Bravi. In the hands of the trio, the use of language and the mannerisms of Manzoni's characters are brought to their extreme. In addition to the Bravi talking like Laurel and Hardy, we have the Cardinal Federico, who talks like Pope Wojtyla, or Perpetua that speaks a Roman dialect. Sometimes this playful use of voices is also linked to a comedy based on disguise and gender swapping. Perhaps this is not aged very well, but we have the nuns of Monza that are all men, and including Gertrude, who is played by Lopez. And here you see the helmet, because they play with the fact that in Monza there is a F1 racing. Or another example is Donna Prassede, who is bald for the occasion, and she is played by Anna Marchesini, but dubbed by Massimo Lopez. So she speaks with this voice. Costumes are also an important part of the parody. The characters actually reproduce rather faithfully the costumes worn by the characters in the novel. In this sense, the trio does not forget that The Betrothed is an illustrated novel, and that the images by Francesco Gonin are as important as the text is. For example, here you can see Lucia wearing the traditional crown of pins that we see in the illustration, but made of lights. And the lights actually explode when the story is resolved, when they get married. Then we have Renzo, who has the same kind of expression here, and the giant hat. And we have also Don Rodrigo. I couldn't find a very good screenshot of the film because the quality wasn't very good. But they still reproduce the same kind of outfit, but with the difference that the proportions are completely wrong. So, for example, you are going to see in a later clip that Don Rodrigo has the same boots, but like they are this huge. So they play with proportion. And same thing, the Griso also has a characteristic headdress that becomes a fishing net. The trio then to the main plot, and they are quite faithful to the main plot of the novel. They add new sketches, and most of these concern the Italian television culture of the late 80s. And we find anything from soap operas, TV documentaries, TV news, shopping channels, and the trio for this collaborated with very famous Italian TV personalities of the time, such as the Pippo Baudo, the aforementioned Pippo Baudo, who for the occasion plays Lucia's father, Pennellone, who sells furniture on TV. And the amazing Vanna Marchi, who is selling anti-plague lotions. And I have to show you the, the sequence very quickly. Because it's very, she became famous by selling cosmetics on TV, and she has a peculiar way of addressing her audience. This was her, and she used to address her public like this. So she's really insulting her public, like saying, "You stink, you suck," and all kind of insults. And by the way, there is also a new Netflix TV show about her, if you want to delve more into Vanna Marchi's history.
She went to jail, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And she served quite a long time.
Yes, she went to jail, and then now she's free, and she made a Netflix TV show. Yeah. Okay, so, but there is also plenty of Italian popular culture, such as football, pop music, cinema, and fairy tales. So we already saw Little Red Riding Hood, but there is also Pinocchio. Here we see the Fatina, the fairy of Pinocchio. Or in some occasion, Lucia is playing Cinderella and Snow White as well. Okay, so if anything, the adaptation of the trio, in the adaptation of the trio, what is being mocked is television itself, especially low quality television, such as soap operas. One particularly successful scene, in my opinion, is the dinner between Don Rodrigo and the Griso, that becomes a parody of a poorly shot and acted soap opera. The reference in the text is chapter 7, when Don Rodrigo asks the Griso to kidnap Lucia. And here is the scene. If it works. Please work. Let's give it a moment. No, I really love this scene.
You can try to exit the presentation and re-enter the presentation.
Let's try. But it worked before. Whatever. Basically, Don Rodrigo is like talking, since he is Spanish, he's talking with this fake Spanish accent that is basically just Italian with S at the end of the words. And then all the shots are wrong, completely wrong, and they don't the head of the characters are chopped, and yeah, whatever. I try one last time and then I move on. Okay, I guess I'll move on. Okay. Yeah, so just to speak a little more, a few details about Don Rodrigo here, the soap opera of Don Rodrigo. So they basically speak with this fake Spanish accent, and they just praise the wine that they drank at dinner for like 3 minutes. So it's like 3 minutes of nonsense conversation about wine and food. Then, moving on, we have the central example of the central episode of the conversion of the Innominato that is transposed through a parody of the television program Mixer, which was a famous talk show that aired between the 1980 and 1998. This repentance of the Innominato is carried out as if it were a repentance of a mafia boss, complete with a Sicilian accent. And here you can see the format of the interview with the journalist Anna Marchesini and the big face of the Innominato on the screen. The interview sequence also addresses another aspect of media, namely the one of turning news into entertainment, including crime. This was probably new at the beginning of the 90s, but today we have many famous TV shows that reenact crime stories or that feature interviews with controversial criminal figures. Then, the trio Parodies also feature some eroticism, and perhaps for rigid Catholics, also even a little blasphemy. Quoting Freud, the literary critic Terry Eagleton says that humor arises from the release of a repressed impulse. Humor that appeals to eroticism, obscene acts, or sexual desire becomes interesting in relation to the repression of these elements in Manzoni's novel. In the trio parody, this kind of humor is present from the beginning. For example, as you can see here, this is Renzo and Agnese, and Renzo repeatedly touches Agnese's breasts, and when he touches her, they begin to sound like alarms. Then we also have Donna Prassede, who tries to seduce Renzo. And we have the Innominato, who is into BDSM practices. You can really see it here, but Marchesini, she is holding a whip and into foot fetishism, actually. In this regard, Luciano Parisi, a literary critic, recalls that eroticism is found in serious adaptation of Manzoni's work. Manzoni could have also been aware that this reticence about eroticism and desire would have given rise to reaction or parodies. As early as 1930, Guido da Verona wrote an erotic version of The Betrothed, in which the addition of erotic and vulgar elements shocked Catholics and earned him a ban by Mussolini. Another version is from the 1970s by this Pietro Chiara, who assumed that the very repressions present in the novel might arouse in Italians a certain anti-clerical, iconoclastic, and desecrating taste. However, it is important to state that while laughing at this kind of jokes implies a relaxation of the repression, it also shows the strength of the inhibition itself. Through a close reading of Manzoni's text, the trio has developed comic and ironic aspects that were already present in the novel. They commented on popular culture and the status of great classics of certain Italian authors and literary texts. More than The Betrothed, it is the reception of The Betrothed that determines the popular approach towards Manzoni in Italy. Because of its status as masterpiece, Manzoni's novel is studied in schools at all levels, from primary school to high school. And I remember that in primary school, my teacher organized a small play of the Betrothed, and I played Lucia. Generally, the way in which Manzoni, the Betrothed, is taught at school focuses on the moral aspect, the religious aspects. This has fostered some kind of distrust in the novel or in the author that is considered conservative or religious, too religious, or just boring. But in better words, here you have the citation from Francesco de Cristofaro, who say that the way that Betrothed has handed it to us, since we are children, can only rustle in our collective unconscious in an indistinct, disturbing, and ultimately harassing way, inducing us to an iconoclastic act as if to disinfest us of tormenting ideological and aesthetic ghosts. For its educative value, Manzoni's novel has also been the subject of many other adaptations in cinema, theater, and TV. The serious ones never seem to develop that ironic way, that ironic aspect that exists in the novel. And here we have some examples. The first ones are silent films, and then we have probably the most famous one is the 1941 one by Camerini. And also TV adaptation. This one was the most famous one from 1967 by Sandro Bolchi. The screenplay was written by Bolchi himself and writer Riccardo Bacchelli, and included an introduction and contextualization of the novel and the author. And it was very faithful to the text. Such fidelity to the text and the emphasis on Catholic moral fulfilled the guiding and educative role that was assigned to state television, in line with the values of the Christian democracy that governed at the time. Just 1 year before the Trio's parody, there was another adaptation by Salvatore Nocita, so we are in 1989, and I included the photo of Don Abbondio because I found out that it was played by Alberto Sordi, actually. So, in the novel, Manzoni appears too, and here he is recognized at the restaurant by the Anna Marchesini, who plays the waitress, and she asks him for an autograph. I try again if I can play it, but I don't believe I can. Of course I cannot, but I mean, it was funny. She asked him for an autograph, and he gives her the image. Finally, Manzoni, who is played by Lopez, also interrupts the actors and accuses them of ruining his masterpiece. He's more than disappointed with the trio, and he's there judging them, and he finally cries and is fed. He cries like a baby and is fed milk by Lucia. Finally, the parody concludes with the Manzoni acting as a TV presenter, of course, and tells the message of the story, il sugo della storia, and presents the main characters while they together sing "We Are the World." So, this is it. Just to conclude, the parody of the trio is, I think, one of the most interesting keys to approach contemporary Italian culture, and especially in its relationship between the monumental and popular culture, offering them a less idealized and a more real image of it. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Serena, for such a brilliant presentation. I hope it works. Yeah, you're gonna see Dolly Parton for just a minute. Okay. Well, this is the title of my presentation of Mice and Men and Ducks. Well, the two Disney parodies of I Promessi Sposi. Since Eugenio said it in Italian, I think that I can say it in Italian too. So, I Promessi Sposi. So, on what it felt like a typical morning of 2006, when my siblings and I were having breakfast, my dad went out to buy the newspaper. And when he returned, we immediately noticed something unusual. In one hand, in fact, Dad was holding the Corriere della Sera. But in the other, he had what looked like a Topolino, but bigger, which is this. In 2006, Il Corriere della Sera started a reprinting in volumes of all the Disney parodies that were created and previously published on the pages of the weekly magazine Topolino. I Promessi Paperi was the first of many. So here you have, like, this is not even half of all the parodies that Disney, Italian Disney, produced during the years. In the back of the book, you have like a list, but there were many, many, many. I had all of them, of course. So the term parody refers to the literary distortion of a well-known text, usually in a comic vein. And depending on the case, during the parodic process, a media transfer may also take place. In this case, for example, from a literary text, we arrive to a graphic novel. Thus, one can speak of adaptation, a process at the end of which the new product presents characteristics proper to the starting product, along with other new and original ones. In the case of Disney parodies, however, the adaptation comes twofold. The final product, in fact, is the result of an encounter between the adapted literary work and the words of the Disney characters, who interpret it. So this creates a literary genre per se, which as such has well-defined characteristics. And over the years, the authors refined their technique and defined genre criteria, coming to inscribe the parodies in three possible scenarios. So in the first scenario, the presence of Disney characters in the fabric of the original work is justified by a pretext that varies from time to time. This is the case, for example, of the Inferno, who was the first one of the parodies. It was published in 1949 on the pages of Topolino. Interestingly enough, during the fascist era, Topolino was the only foreign publication that was allowed in Italy. So interesting. So yeah, in the case of the Inferno, Topolino, who is Mickey Mouse, and Pippo, who is Goofy, after the stage performance of the comedy, are hypnotized by Abdul, a magician friend of Pietro Gambadilegno, who I believe in English is Peg Leg Pete, and condemned to never stop wearing Dante and Virgil's costumes. And in the library, of course, they fall asleep reading Dante, because that's what you do when you read Dante, and they go into the pages of the book. And their adventures then are shrouded in a dreamlike haze, giving the story the state of uncertainty between reality and fiction that is shared by the comedy itself. In this case, the spell is not broken by God, but by Dante, who is like Deus Ex Machina, and appears in the last pages actually to condemn the two writers. He condemns them, so the two authors portray themselves in the novel as traditori massimi, so they ruined Dante's work. Dante is very upset, but in the end he's like, well, whatever, what's done is done, and he sends back Topolino and Pippo to Topolinia. So that's an happy ending. In the second possible scenario, the boundaries between parody and original became blurred, so that it is impossible for those unfamiliar with the original work to distinguish the parody from any other comic book story. This is the case, for example, of Paperino il Conte di Monte Cristo, so the Count of Monte Cristo, Mount Christ maybe, set in contemporary Paperopoli. So unlike the character of Dante, who in the Inferno of Topolino remains in his original literary dimension, here the abbot Faria enters the duck's world. Sorry. Without, oh my God, I am completely lost. Well, whatever, so he enters the world. And you have Paperino is upset with his uncle and with Uncle Scrooge, Zio Paperone, and with his cousin Gaston, who is very lucky, and is, of course, still the Donald Duck that we all know, very, very unlucky. I'm so sorry, I'm making a mess. Well, whatever. So the third possible scenario is what happens with the Promessi Topi and I Promessi Paperi. So it's the most common one, actually, and involves a total blending of the Disney word and that of the original text. So not only will the plot be more recognizable and inscribed within the parody genre, but also the costumes, the setting, and even the characteristics of the characters will be adapted based on the original. So to this category belongs the Promessi Paperi and the Promessi Topi. So the Promessi Paperi was published in 1976 and Promessi Topi 1989. So when approaching the subject, one of my first questions was why the Promessi Sposi was the first volumes of the series, why not Dante, since it's, Dante, and also it was the first, chronologically speaking, published. So editorial choices is certainly interesting and indicative of the importance of the Promessi Sposi. I'm so sorry, I really don't know. Yes, so if in school, in fact, the Divine Comedy and the Promessi Sposi I read, loved, and hated with more or less the same intensity, from a parody point of view, they are on different levels. So published more than a decade apart, as I said, in 1976 and 1989, these two graphic novels fall fully much more than the Inferno di Topolino into the Disney parody tradition. Among the reasons that make these two parodies more popular and accessible to the general public, one must certainly consider the position occupied by the original itself. Throughout the text, in fact, using his well-known irony, Manzoni comments on, underlines, and detaches himself from the subject, thus inserting the Betrothed much more than the Commedia by Dante into the game of mirrors typical of any parody adaptation. So, without further ado, I'm gonna talk about the Promessi Paperi, who is the first one. So this is the beginning. The beginning is pretty faithful to the original. So quel ramo del lago di Como che volge a mezzogiorno, and here you can see the castle that is owned by Don Paperigo, who is Don Rodrigo, Don Paperigo, is played by Uncle Scrooge, so Zio Paperone in Italian. So here you can see an iconic landscape, with the castle. So the choice of naming the squire Don Paperigo, obviously played by Uncle Scrooge on the first page, is also intuited by the adjective stingy, taccagno in Italian, which is a characteristic that it's not proper to the Manzoni character, but it's certainly proper of Uncle Scrooge, because as we all know, he loves money, and he has a ton of money, and that is his castle, made of money. So if in the Promessi Sposi, the two main characters can be identified without a shadow of doubt with the figures of Renzo and Lucia, it is equally true that the driving force of the story is Don Rodrigo himself, who, having fallen in love with Lucia, radically changes their life. So without Don Rodrigo, there wouldn't be any story because they would have been married. Thus, Segantini, who is the one who wrote the story, chooses to bring the figure of Don Rodrigo to the foreground, making it clear who is the real architect of the events. Unlike the Manzonian character, however, Don Paperigo does not forbid, but rather imposes the wedding. So using the Bravotti, who is the name for the Bassotti, who is the Beagle Boys, I think in English, they become Bravotti. He forces Paperenzo, who is Donald Duck, this is the Bravotti, an inspiring poet, Donald Duck is Paperenzo, an inspiring poet, to marry the scocciatrice of Monza, which is Brigitta, that it's only in the Italian comics. She's not an American character. She is actually invented by Romano Scarpa, who is always accompanied by her faithful guardian, Don Cicciondio, which is Ciccio. I think it's something with gas goose, maybe in English. So they play with the name Ciccio, Abbondio, Cicciondio. As in classic Disney stories, in fact, Brigitta, so Gertruda, is in love, unrequited, with Uncle Scrooge, Don Rodrigo. In a scene that reminds the beginning of the Promessi Sposi, when the bravi stop Don Abbondio and force him not to perform the wedding between Renzo and Lucia, here the Bravotti bar the way for Pape Renzo and force him instead to marry Gertruda. So questo matrimonio sta da fare, you have to marry her. Why? Because that's the only way in which Don Papirigo can get rid of Gertruda if she is married to someone else. But Gertruda doesn't want to marry Pape Renzo, she wants to marry Don Rodrigo. Pape Renzo, too, is already promised to Lucilla Paperella, who is here, played by Paperina, so Daisy. And Pape Renzo doesn't know how to tell her that he was threatened by the Bravi. So unlike in the original story, that Renzo, Lucia says immediately to Renzo, and so it becomes clear that the wedding is forbidden by Don Rodrigo. Here, until the very end, Lucilla, as Paperilla, has no idea what is going on. She just knows that Pape Renzo cannot marry her anymore. She's very upset about it, of course. So Pape Renzo has to leave the town, and it turns out to be not only a victim, but also the cause of the Great Plague that takes over in the following pages of I Promessi Paperi. So desperate because he doesn't want to marry Gertruda, but unable to rebel against the will of Don Papirigo, Pape Renzo goes to the laboratory of the alchemist Mescola Intrugli, who is like Azzeccagarbugli, played by Archimede. And he provides him with the solution, the elixir of strike. So basically, in his intention, the idea is to make the Bravotti inspire the flumes of the perfume so they would strike and they would not work for Don Rodrigo anymore. And so he would be free from the minacce. But that doesn't happen because Paperino is, of course, very unlucky. So on the way back, the elixir broke and the perfume arrived to Milan. And that is very funny because the plague, in Italian is peste, becomes the poste. So the first person who strikes are the one who work for the post office. So that's a total mess. The city is upside down. They don't want to work. They're on strike. And so with a clever word pun, the Manzonian peste is here transformed into the postal strike, which leaves the city in chaos. And Pape Renzo arrives in Milan when the strike is going on and people are leaving because it's not possible that the post office is not working. So in the midst of all this chaos, Pape Renzo finds a letter that addressed casually for him. And it's from his cousin, Gastolo, who is played by Gastone. That is, of course, like the contralto for Pape Renzo. Pape Renzo is super unlucky. Gastone is very lucky. And in the end, so there is like two parts of the story. So Pape Renzo is on the other side of the Adda with Gastolo, and the lord of this part of town, of this part of the region of Lombardy, is Mainomato, who is Rocker Duck and is kind of like the innominato, but is like a less meaner version of Don Rodrigo. So it's very different from the original one. So yeah, meanwhile at Don Rodrigo's castle, Rocker Duck enters the scene playing the Mainomato. While in the original, the Innominato is much more feared and respected than Don Rodrigo, in the parody, Mainomato is in position of subversion to the wealthier squire, Don Rodrigo. So the two lords sign an agreement in which Mainomato, so that is the leader of the province in which Pape Renzo now lives with Gastolo, will capture Pape Renzo and hand it back to Don Rodrigo. With the promise of a job as a paid poet, Mainomato forces Pape Renzo to sign the contract in which he will promise to marry Gertruda. However, soon after, he will tear the paper apart after hearing a song by Pape Renzo in which referred to him as a little neighbor of the much greater Don Rodrigo. So Mainomato's conversion takes place, but not in the epic and tragic manner of the unnamed, who buries his pride and allows himself to be invested by the good. Mainomato is wounded in pride, and it is from this affront that his rebellion against Don Rodrigo begins. The resolution of the events, however, comes from the two female characters, of course, Gertruda and Lucilla Paperilla. So the male characters are making a mess, and the two women are like, no, we're gonna fix this. So when Paperenzo finally reveals to both of them Don Rodrigo's plan, they go to the tax collector and announce the evader Don Paperigo. So Don Paperigo not only is very rich, but he doesn't pay taxes. So the two arrive and he's submerged with all these tax payments and bills that he didn't pay. So the story ends with Don Paperigo being in the town square, like in the Gogna. And an exultant Gertruda is waiting for the sentence to be served so she can marry him. So in the end, there is a wedding, and it's a wedding between Gertruda and Don Rodrigo, and of course also between Lucilla and Paperilla and Paperenzo. So this is the Promessi Paperi. The Promessi Sposi was published in 1989. The Promessi Topi, I'm sorry. So here it's even funnier, I think, because it's from an idea of Alessandro Manzoni. And the beginning is iconic because instead of having like the usual beginning, so quel ramo del lago di Como che volge a mezzogiorno tra due file ininterrotte di turisti. So here the problem are the tourists. Tourists from Germany that arrived and they want to be on the lake, they want to be served, and they want to stay. Which is great for one of the people who owns the two inns in the city, who is, of course, Don Pietrigo, which is played by Pegleg Pete, who is very happy by this. And this is very funny. The German guys talk with this, like, Teutonic accent. So in Italian would be like, una camera preco, which is, I don't know, funny. It's accentuated with the K, and also here at the restaurant, he's saying, yeah, ma la cucina italiana, mi piace un sacco, I love the Italian kitchen, or whatever. So, if the descent of the Lanzichenecchi is already mentioned by Manzoni as one of the possible causes of the advent of the plague, in the parody it is instead considered a fortune for Don Pietrigo, who owns one of the two inns of the city. The manager and owner of the other is Lucia Minella, Minnie. So Don Pietrigo would like to unite the two inns in what he calls a mutually beneficial deal, but Lucia has already accepted the contract proposal of Renzo Topolino, who is him, Mickey Mouse, who is a cook in the town's restaurant and would like to combine his activity with Lucia's inn. But Don Pietrigo is determined to prevent the union in business, as well in life, of the two mice, and sends his bravi to frighten the notary Don Pippondio. So this is Don Pippondio, played by Goofy, and he's coming back home. He's reading a quote by this book by Alessandro Manzoni, and it's a book of aphorisms. And the famous phrase, carne ade, who was this man, that Don Abbondio utters at the beginning of the 8th chapter of the novel, is replaced here by, Manzoni, chi era costui, who was this man? So the author of the original enters in the parody and becoming a parody of himself. The Bravi threatens Don Pippondio to not sign the contract between Renzo Topolino and Lucia Minella, and a frightened Don Pippondio rushes home. So this is them, questo contratto non sa da fare, né ora né mai, so it's not a wedding, it's a contract, and he doesn't have to help them, he's a notary, so he doesn't help them to sign the papers. So Don Pippondio rushes home where Clarabella, who is Clarabelle the cow, she's like the faithful and gossipy housekeeper, is there to take perpetual care of him. So she's the Perpetua, she is Perpetua. And the expedient of the Latinorum used by Don Pippondio and Azzeccagarbugli to take advantage of the villagers and leave them in the dark is also used by Don Pippondio to delay the signing of the contract. So here he's saying, Iuris Paperini, Iuris Archimedibus, Iuris... and Renzo Topolino said, I don't know what to do with your Latinorum, keep it for yourself. So as happens in the Promessi Sposi, here too the stories multiply and follow their own different narrative thread, only to meet in the finale. So here we have 3 different threads. We have the first one where Lucia Minella, who is like very similar to the Lucia then also Serena show, she's kidnapped by the Bravi and she's taken to the castle of the Innominato, who is played by Black Spot, Macchia Nera. And in the same time, Renzo is able to escape from the Bravi and he flees to Milan. Where is another plague? And this is amazing. So the plague here, the peste, is not a plague, is a kid. She's the daughter of like of this Spanish royalty, and she arrived in Milan because her uncle is the governor of Milan, and she only wants to eat croissants. She doesn't want to eat bread. So that's why they call her, in Italian, when you have like a very capricious baby, you call them a peste. So that's the pun that they used. So she's very spoiled and demands to eat only sweets and croissants. At the same time, Clarabella asks for help from the sorceress of Monza, who is Nocciola, Azo, maybe. She's the witch. But of course, as it happens in the Disney world, the traditional one, the characters keep their founding characteristics. So Don Pipondio does not believe in magic as much as Goofy doesn't, and both Nocciola and the sorceress of Monza will not be able to change his mind. Gambadilegno, so pig-leg Pete, is always the antagonist who will inevitably be defeated, and Mickey Mouse, thanks to his proverbial cunning, will be the one to free Milan from the plague with a stratagem. So thanks to the collaboration of the palace inhabitants and Questor Acchiappa, so this is actually the plague, so you can see people very upset because they want to eat bread. Basta, siamo stufi di croissant, vogliamo il pane. And here Renzo meets Acchiappa Garbugli, who is Basettoni, and his deputy Panetta, who is Manetta. And he will make little Esmeralda, the dreaded plague, believe that all the inhabitants of the palace have contracted a contagious disease, the tortillo, whose only cure seems to be giving up eating sweets and start eating fruits and vegetables, which of course she doesn't want to do that. So they're faking their sickness, and Enzo plays like this doctor who's saying, yes, they're very sick, so the only way to cure it is to eat vegetables, and she leaves. So Milan is free from the peste. So yeah, she goes back to Spain. In I Promessi Topi, the Manzonian original is always held up as a model of reference, especially with regard to the digressions about the sorceress of Monza, so the Monaca di Monza, and the Innominato. Just as in Manzoni, in fact, here these characters, mistakenly considered secondary, rise to a primary role precisely because of their past. So the sorceress of Monza, just as happens to the nun, is forced by her father to become a witch when her real dream was to become an actress. So since she was a little, because she was super ugly, which is problematic right now, they want her to make her a witch. She doesn't want to do that. She wants to become an actress, but it's a little bit complicated, of course, because of the way she looks. So at the very end, she has a chance. She can be on stage finally, but the public is not very happy with her being like the main leader of the play. And so it's very funny because they're talking in this Roman dialect and they say like, facce vedere sta fata. I don't really know how to do that, but so they want to see someone beautiful, and well, this witch appears on scene. And so she's very sad. She goes back to her dad and he buys her like this shop for her to be a witch in the end. So similarly, Count Macchianera, so Black Spot, whom everyone avoids because they're afraid of the misfortune attached to this name, thanks to Lucia Minella, begins to perform good deeds and rediscover his innate goodness. So this is Conte Macchianera, is very... They believe that just pronouncing his name is like something bad is going to happen. So even here, that the name is only written, it's raining all the time. So the happy ending. So here, the Innominato wants to become good. So Lucia says, you can be good, and in the end, he becomes good. So he frees them, and he takes them back to the place where they came from. So instead of arresting Don Pietrigo and the Bravi, Renzo Topolino decides to hire them as waiters for his restaurant that he reopened with Lucia. And the story ends with an appeal to the 24 readers, so one less than Manzoni. And that is fatal reproduction of that of the Betrothed, more or less. So here also there is another wedding happening that doesn't need to be happening. So Don Pippondio doesn't want to marry Clarabella, but Clarabella is in love with him now. And so it's like, please, this wedding has not to take place. This is the end. So if you like the story, then love its characters and the one who wrote it. If on the other end you didn't like it, then comes just in time the word end. Okay, just to conclude, I would like to briefly pose the attention on the final edition of I Promessi Sposi, the so-called Quarantana. So this edition differs from the previous ones, not only from the linguistic point of view, but also because of the graphic body that it offers. Designed by Manzoni himself and the illustrator Francesco Gonin, each page of the book is enclosed with a double frame and begins with an illustrated capital letter, and then continues with images that underline and comment on parts of the text or introduce characters, such as the famous portrait of Gertrude at the end of the author's description in chapter 9, which is this one. So as Francesca Malagnini suggests, each of these visual elements have their own function. The header image heralds the topic of the chapter, the capital letter emphasizes a key passage, and the concluding illustration connects the capital letter on the next chapter. Okay, now I'm lost again. So what she says is that this image contributes to create another text. So it's very important to keep publishing this version, but this version is rarely published. So for some reason, there needs to be research more. The image kind of disappeared as when the book was republished and published and published. But if Manzoni wanted them to be there, we might think that they were an important part of the text. In fact, they contributed to create the Promessi Sposi and the final edition of it. And to conclude, 25 years after the publication of the Quarantana, so 1840 and 1865, Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland, supposed to be moving, yes, says, what is the use of a book without pictures or conversations? Thank you.
Working? Yes, it is. Thank you, Serena and Anita. This has been fantastic. I think, we have learned a lot. And I think you did confirm my point about the fact that there's some serious stuff going on here, even if we have been talking about parodies and comic things or light-hearted sort of revisitations of the Promessi Sposi. I kind of took a few notes because while I had read your papers before, it's always, I think, good to rethink through these materials. And there are a couple of things which I wanted to highlight, and of course, then you can sort of respond and comment. It's interesting that both the TV adaptation and the comics do make very good use of the sort of some of the most iconic, textually speaking, moments of the novel. Of course, the beginning is always, even if in the comics, it's quickly turned into something else, the very beginning, the incipit of the text is always there. And then you have some sentences which of course have become almost proverbial in the Italian language. The Latinorum comes up. Questo matrimonio non sa da fare, right? I mean, these kind of sentences are really embedded in the Italian lexicon at this point, and they come up in these sort of adaptations, and that's, I think, a confirmation of the fact that this novel, piaccia oppure no, has really kind of deep roots in our sort of identity. The other point which I wanted to make is that all these parodies confirm something else. which I think can be said more broadly about parodies, is the fact that when a text gets to be made the object of a parody, this is one of the best indexes of the text's quality and also of the success. Because, you know, the only way for a parody to work out is that the people who are reading or watching it will immediately seize upon the original, right? So there's a conversation going on here between the original and these parodies, which is extremely revealing in terms of the fortune of a given work. Very briefly, a couple of things on each specific case. I think that the TV adaptation is really a kind of a tour de force in projecting some of the features of Italian culture in those years. It is interesting that I was misremembering, because I thought the TV adaptation of the trio was from the late 80s, but in fact it's from 1990. Of course, it means that it was made in the late 80s. But the newish Rai sceneggiato of 1989 had just appeared. And I mean, I remember that as well. And that was a big production of Rai. Kind of, you know, it was the first big remake of the Bolchi sceneggiato, which had already been extremely popular in Italy. So something which is happening here is that we have the TV series version of the Promessi Sposi in 1989, the one with Alberto Sordi, and the big cast, huge cast of international stars. And then in 1990, the Rai also comes up with an adaptation. And, you know, we do know that many people had watched the 1989 series version. So I think there's something to be said about this closeness. And then the 1989 comic adaptation is from that particular moment as well. So we have a couple of years, 1989, 1990, where these things happen. The TV adaptation from the trio, I think, is really... I mean, we could talk for hours about it, because it's not only a parody of the Promessi Sposi, but it's really one of the best documents, to my mind, of what, you know, Italian culture and was in the late 80s, and what the impact of television had been in Italian culture. And there's something very lighthearted about it, but also something very serious. I think that, you know, the Promessi Sposi of the trio can also be used as a lens through which to understand where we are today with all the problems of Italian culture more broadly. You know, there are so many interesting connections coming up there, which are really worth exploring in that respect. And the comics, I mean, again, I think they also show that, you know, the response to the novel can be really at many levels. You know, you can argue that Topolino, Paperino are sort of characters for kids. But really, I mean, we do know that these kind of adaptations remain in the culture more broadly. And there's an investment in the, you know, book market for those kind of things. The idea that the parodies of the, you know, the Disney parodies were then sold with the Corriere della Sera is quite emblematic of the circulation which these works had. So there's a going back and forth between serious culture, pop culture adaptations, which is not only you know, interesting in terms of studying the original work and its reception, but also studying what happens to the country and to the national identity through the successful reception of a given work like the Promessi Sposi. So if on any of these thoughts you wish to expand or elaborate, I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, I have something to say. No, does it work? Yes? Okay. No, it's good that you mentioned the Salvatore Nocita's adaptation that just came in 1989, and I don't know, we can only like make thoughts or hypotheses about it, but I think that it can be also looked in the from the point of view of the changing role of state television, for example. So as we know, in Italy in the 80s, like there was the birth of private television, Berlusconi stuff and everything. So I think that the RAI had to reinvent herself in a way, and also like capture that kind of audience that was going through the kind of entertainment that the new private television were offering. But while the new private television were basically broadcasting like things from abroad, like especially from the US, I think that Rai wanted to stick to something that was probably Italian. And so there is this, it's very interesting to see this double, the two double products, such as the serious one, and also Ennio Morricone did the soundtrack for the adaptation. And there are a lot of famous actors and stuff. So on the one side, there is that kind of, I think, a will of continuing the educational and serious role that the Rai had since its beginning, and so the education role, but also with the trio parody, also try to work on that and take it a little less seriously, and at the same time provide some cultural comment on what was happening at the beginning of the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for clarifying that, because I think that your sort of explanation now makes it even clearer that we can watch the Promessi Sposi del Trio really as a critique of the Italian television of those years. And I think your point about the public TV versus the commercial TVs of those years, which were really expanding quickly, is really getting to the point. Because, again, one can laugh about all we see in the adaptation, but then if you look at it through the broader structure of the story, all those references are really used not just to make people laugh, but also, to my mind, to make people think. I think it's probably easier to see it now than it was at the time, but I think that the critique they're doing is ferocious here. The soap opera, or actually the telenovela example is great. The televendita, everything was about tele in those years, right? The televendita, the telenovela, the concorso di bellezza, there's that point, the Miss Lecco, which of course is a pun, right? But the Miss Lecco, and I'm really trying to avoid the pun, is also extremely interesting, because it's a critique of all the Miss Italia sort of tradition, right? So the thing can be read in these multiple ways. And something which I think is an interesting connection, again, to what Anita was talking to us about, and I'm curious to hear something about this, the blending of various stories. Because, what happens with the trio, and correct me, Serena, if I'm wrong, is that in a way, the core of the plot remains, of course, that of the Promessi Sposi. And we have these camei, these sort of insertions, which are really coming out of the world of the late 1980s. So the world in which the trio was living and selling their products, in a way, comes into the story. But the plot is clearly following Manzoni. With the comics, as Anita showed us, we have much more liberty and much more freedom in retelling the story. And I'm wondering to what extent this has to do, for instance, with the fact that the readers were expected to be mostly kids. Because all the features of the characters are really, as you were saying, very close to what those characters embody in the Topolino series, right? So the features of Paperone get to be sort of superimposed onto those of Don Rodrigo, or the features of Paperino and Paperina gets to be superimposed on Renzo and Lucia. So there's much more freedom and much more closeness to the model out of which the parody is constructed.
Yes, I agree. But also there is something I was thinking about, for example, when reading the Promessi Paperi and the pestilence, that it's like the strike and the poste, like what a kid can understand of it. Like, I believe that it's clear in this sense that it's not meant only for kids. It's meant also for adults, also because adult people wrote it. It's not wrote by kids. So they inserted something that they were familiar with, like the fact that the Italian post office, you go in, I believe it's everywhere, but especially in Italy, you go there and you spend the whole day waiting in line. And my mom used to work for the post, so I know. So you go there and you spend all your day. So if there is a strike, it's even worse because at the end, like, nothing functions anymore. So yeah, I think that some characters are made, some things in the parodies are made for kids. For example, the fact that you mentioned that a lot of the characteristics of the Disney characters are maintained and superimposed over the original one. But there are also inserts of this adult word that comes in for like the poster, or even like, I don't like the peste, for example, is a peste only because kids will be more than happy than only that they have only to eat desserts and sweets. But adults know, because they say, oh no, you have to eat your vegetables and your fruits. So the peste is really for Renzo and for the adults that live in Milan, not for the kids. So yeah, I don't know. It's like an interesting mix of both, I think.
Yeah, no, and I think the sort of the expectations of the audience in that case is really a double-sided one, because of course the kids come to the Promessi Sposi, to the Promessi Topi, to the Promessi Paperi, having in mind those characters from Disney, because maybe they read Topolino, and Topolino, I don't know whether that is still the case, but it used to come out every week. I think Wednesday was the day.
It's still the case.
Is it still on Wednesdays?
Yeah, it's still on Wednesdays.
So I remember, waiting Topolino, and I have to say that I kept reading Topolino till the age when I was already familiar with the Promessi Sposi. And one of the beautiful things is that you can go back to all these parodies and appreciate them at various levels. But certainly we have an interesting sort of clash there with the characters bringing their own features. And something which I really liked in your presentation, I don't know whether you did it in purpose, but I think it was very nice, is that you were referring to the characters in the Promessi Topi and Promessi Paperi almost as actors, and playing the part of. So the part of Renzo is played by Topolino, and the part of Lucia is played by Minnie. And so that's, I think, something which is, of course, again, part of the way in which the story is built, and that's why it's so effective. And of course, parents reading their own children's copy of Topolino might be able to pick on things which would escape likely a kid. Like, the Latinorum reference is very clear to anybody who has read the Promessi Sposi, but maybe not for 7 years old child reading it. So I think that was a very interesting gesture. Shall we open it to questions and sort of discussion for questions for Serena and Anita? Of course, you're very welcome to. Yes, Stefano.
Just simply continuing the conversation that we're having regarding the parody of the trio. It's a pastiche of genre, deliberately, right? They have different insertions. And that makes total sense with Manzoni. When he opens a parenthesis, he says, this is a parenthesis I'm opening. Feel free to skip it or to read it if you want. And it's like the stories within the story. And each of them has a specific feature. And here also graphically, they give you the idea that they're doing something else. And even the fact that they have the Innominato presented as in mixer, and Manzoni does that when he has the interjections of the grida that he reproduces in their entirety, and they're extremely boring to read, and they were a torment for poor Michael to translate into English. But it's like he brings you into that style completely. You're absorbed. So the fact that you have somebody that repented, that converted, what is the frame of reference for the people of your time? It's Gianni Minoli, mixer, doing these heart-to-heart interviews, with the big faces that fill the screen. So I think re-watching it and rethinking about the trio parody, there are so many elements that are so well studied and makes total sense with Manzoni, like bringing in elements from today's life as additions, as annexes to the main story, and not only reproduced for the story, but even the style in which the story is told. So I thought that was really brilliant, and your presentation was very, very good. And the Topolino had your same doubt while you were talking about the whole thing, the peste, le poste. It's almost like surreal. It's like, and they make us laugh a lot. I believe these were written for the parents of the kids, not for the kids, because kids probably would be totally lost. I mean, they would catch some sort of story, but that doesn't make any sense. All these people, all of a sudden, in Disney comics, wanting to marry. Nobody marries. They're all zio e zia, or they're eternally engaged, like Topolino and Minnie. And so all of a sudden, they get a story in which everybody wants to marry or run away from a marriage. It doesn't make sense in the mind of the kids that were used to the traditional stories. So definitely, to me, the readership of these rewriting of the classics were the parents, also because they were the ones that would buy it in the edicola. Yeah. And of course, what you were mentioning, the Nicita, Salvatore Nicita, 1989, that was a major moment. It was, I would say, the last great enterprise of a RAI that still was exercising a sort of monopoly over television. You said very correctly that the 80s is the time in which commercial television, private televisions come to the surface, and they start becoming principal actors in the culture and artistic scene of the country. Of course, to me, in a very bad way, but they exist. So RAI, with this attempt, was really trying to prove that the public service still made sense, still had a central role in the cultural life of the country. And whereas the first adaptation, the 1961, 61? 67, I was born, of Bolchi, that was this really key point. It was the idea that television could transform a great novel into great television that was theater. That was the main difference between the 1967 Bolchi. He hired all the greatest stage actors that were available at that time, not film actors. Paola Pitagora and all the great protagonists of Italian theater found a role, and it's a very theatrical adaptation. It's almost completely shot inside in the studios, very, very intimate, lots of close-ups on the faces, typical of theater. Nocita, they asked him to do a colossal production, and whereas the first one was supposed to appeal to Italians because the actors were all staple names of the Italian theater tradition, in the 1989 Nocita adaptation, RAI was aiming at reclaiming a role, a central role in Italy, and at the same time at bringing this abroad. They were hoping that these would be the sceneggiato that would make it in the States, in France, and so on. It didn't go exactly that way, but they hired Burt Lancaster to be Cardinal Federico, and Franco Nero and other international actors. They really aimed at creating no longer a theatrical TV adaptation, but a cinematographic grand adaptation. And of course, they were very invested in it. It was massively publicized and advertised. And of course, these productions come up on the wave of the Nicita adaptation. Michael, yes, of course.
In sort of listening to your presentations and seeing this, both the parody and the Topolino version, I was thinking of how easily Manzoni lends himself to parody, though, and I'm very tempted now to sort of redo, not the entire translation, but certain parts of it, because throughout I felt kind of restrained, that I couldn't go too far, because clearly, there are these elements that are so melodramatic, so over the top with Manzoni, where he's talking, well, in English we'd say scoundrels and villains, and birbanti, these very sort of, terms that you hear today and you kind of laugh, right? So it's all a little bit over the top. And, part of me wants to just sort of go back in certain parts and just get rid of all the restraints and then just do a parody myself. But I mean, I sort of felt that it was my responsibility, since people really didn't know the original work itself so well, that we had to start there, and maybe that would be the next step. But I was just, I guess, wondering whether in your initial reading, maybe when you were in school, in grade school, whether you sort of found it a little bit exaggerated, silly, maybe comical in ways that the teacher didn't quite appreciate.
Actually, I was telling Serena this the other day, because I have to thank my teacher for making me see it, like the comical side of the Promessi Sposi, because I believe it's in the 3rd chapter where when Renzo goes to oh my God, now I'm mixing up the names with the Disney parodies. Azzeccagarbugli, yeah, okay. And he brings like the 2 capponi, capons. And so my teacher, I was in the ginnasio, she made us wrote the trip, the journey of Renzo from the point of view of the capons. So that was really funny. And I think that most people in my class were shocked, because they were like, we're at the Liceo Classico, we cannot write this stuff about the capponi. But I thought it was like a brilliant way to make us appreciate some parts of the Promessi Sposi. For the most part was just boring, I'm gonna say. But this part was funny. So I think that even in the Liceo, if the professors are, I don't know, smart enough, they can make students see that there are stuff that can be, I don't know, enjoyable and not only a torture.
Yeah, no, I agree with Anita. Actually, I didn't have any experience of finding the Promessi Sposi funny, actually. Anzi, it was very like dramatic, and I remember that we had to read this novel with a very serious attitude. And when I was mentioning that I did the play in my primary school, and I was playing Lucia, of course the teacher would tell me to be as dramatic as possible, because especially when I was doing the Addio ai Monti scene. So I don't have that experience, but that is is fun. But yeah, so actually it was my first time like rereading, when we did the course with Eugenio, rereading Manzoni and finding that point of view. I didn't even remember the fiction at the beginning of the book. That is kind of fun too. So yeah, I think it's something that it's easy to change for, like, I don't know, high school teachers or stuff.
Regarding the parody of the trio, when there is the element of bondage and sadomaso in the Innominato, I know that there is an entire group of French literary critics that responded to the Italian criticism that il Promessi Sposi is il romanzo senza idillio. There is no real love, passion in it, right? And these French critics actually underline these elements that would come from the Marquis de Sade and the tradition of the libertine novel or the sadomasochiste. They say there is no passionate love between Renzo and Lucia, but there is this sort of morbid, kinky passions of the nun and Don Rodrigo. So don't look for that kind of passionate sensuality in the 2 protagonists, but look around and you will find it. So I find that probably the trio was not aware, and I think actually this wave of criticism comes in the 90s, so after. But there is an intuition there of something, that there is even that element. And of course, Manzoni was familiar with the writings of the Marquis de Sade and with that tradition of the libertine novel in which sex was contrived and hidden, but for that very reason, more appealing and more kinky.
Right. So I think if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank Anita and Serena again for sharing their work on Manzoni, and thank you all for being here with us. So go back to, go back home and do watch again the Promessi Sposi del Trio, and go and read the Promessi Topi and Promessi Paperi. That's going to be fun. Thank you all.